Hi everyone. If you are watching this video, essentially you are looking for how to get started with the school year, with a classroom, with basically everything. And so I'm just going to break it down into a couple different areas so that you know exactly how to get started and hopefully feel very confident when setting up your classroom, or at least, if not super confident, you have a place to start and knowing what to do or what things to think about when setting up your classroom, when preparing for like the first couple weeks of school, what materials you need, all of those things. So to get started, I'm going to talk about first setting up your classroom. However, a lot of these, like the materials to prep and classroom setup, can kind of go hand in hand because you have to ask yourself similar questions when it comes to certain things. Um, so to look into how to set up your classroom, I would go to the page for Coach's Corner or Coaching Corner, and find the like new teacher checklist, and it walks you through several questions. I pulled up that document that I just referred to, and I'm going to go through it with you guys just to kind of talk about some things and to go over some things with you. So when you're a new teacher or when you're starting out, when you're like, whether it's a new classroom or it's a new district, you could have been teaching for 20 years and then now you're doing something different. So you don't necessarily have to be a new teacher. But if something's new to you and you're trying to figure out where to start, here's some general questions that you can ask yourself. The first one is, what are your classroom expectations? And there's also slides that I have provided for you guys right with this checklist on the Coaching Corner page. So I would check that out definitely. Some things to think about would be, and I wish somebody would have told me this my first year of teaching, is just think things through, which sounds very obvious. But when thinking about expectations or thinking about how my classroom was to be run, I wish that I would have taken the time or had the wherewithal when I was a first year teacher to really think about how I would react to certain situations, like what my expectations would be for certain things. And so that being said, with classroom expectations, I really challenge you to think through, what will your like expectations be for these areas and more. There will be other things that come up, but really think through how your expectations are going to be, how you're going to react if they're not met, and so on and so forth. So the first one is bathroom and drink break. So what are your expectations for when kids take bathroom breaks or go get a drink? Do you want them to do that? Do you not want them to do that? If they're going to leave your classroom to do that, like what's your system for getting them a pass so that they're allowed to be out in the halls? Or how are they going to sign out of your classroom so you can keep track of where every student is during that time? Um, Off limit areas or areas where you don't want kids to be, you with any expectations, you really need to explicitly teach them what your expectations are, and where to go and where not to go is definitely high priority, especially if you have an area that is solely for a teacher, or so like it has resources that kids should not be getting into. So off limits areas would be another thing. Voice level, meaning like during certain activities, how loud or how silent do you want them to be? Moving around the classroom, going over how you want them to move around the classroom, or how you want them to get up out of their seats, how you want them to exit the classroom if they're going to exit the classroom, any of those things. Behaviors, or simply put, like how are you going to respond to students who are not doing what you want them to do? So how are you going to respond to those behaviors? There are several other things you can think about for classroom expectations, but we'll get to those in the upcoming questions. Number two is, what kind of classroom environment do you want to have? So when thinking about setting up your classroom, what do you want it to look like? When kids or anybody walk into your room, how do you want it to feel for them? And then you also, through this, have to think about like what is going to be your style of teaching? How are you going to set things up so that it kind of mirrors that or doesn't? So think about, will you be doing a lot of lectures? If you're going to be doing a lot of lectures where kids have to be focused and upfront looking at you, maybe desks would be the way to go, or some sort of setup where that is how your room is set up so that they can look at you and focus with minimal distraction. Do you want your students to work together a lot? If you do want them to work together a lot, maybe you have tables or maybe you have some configuration with desks that allow them to easily be able to work with each other. Do you need to have designated areas for certain things? For example, do you want to have a reading nook? Are you going to be doing lots of small group or table work? Or do you need to have like an area to do centers? Whatever, however you want to set up your classroom, as far as that goes, those are things to keep in mind as well. Because with any classroom, you have limited space, so you're trying to figure out how can you utilize the space that you have to give you the most of what you're wanting as far as what that classroom environment will be like. I already kind of brought this up, but do you want desks or tables? In my classroom, I have desks. I have that because in my classroom, I want my classroom to feel uh, very homey. I want kids to feel very comfortable in that. But I also, with the way that my lessons run and things are structured, need to be able to monitor students easily. And so the way that I have my desk is very very standard classroom where they're all facing forward. However, I have them strategically placed so that they can work with partners pretty easily. And I also have a couple of tables in my room when I'm pulling like small groups. I have a horseshoe table to work with groups. There's a couple other tables where like when students want to work in groups, they can work there. And so I've set it up that way. So I kind of have what I would say is the best of both worlds because I don't do a ton of lecturing, but I do have students work independently enough, especially when they're showing me what they can do on their own or they're doing some performance, like knowledge check quiz, those kind of things that I needed to have those desks. But I also like when students work with each other and when there is that collaboration time. So you got to figure out what works best for you, and also know what materials you have that you can work with as well. And then the last thing is, what do you want posted on your walls or your bulletin boards? How are you going to set those up? And yeah, depending on what grade level you teach, this could be very different. I know a lot of elementary teachers, they have like a themed bulletin board for every month to correlate with the holidays, those kind of things. Secondary, I feel like teachers don't do that as much. I am technically a secondary teacher. I teach 7th grade, and I definitely have a bulletin board that my kids decorate for each holiday. And so you can really just make that work. And then also about thinking about what are going to be on the bulletin boards and the walls. Are you going to have any anchor charts up? Are you going to have any area to display things that students really need to reference frequently? Like I have a couple of skills that I go over as far as like close reading with students, or like certain writing styles that I have posters up in my room because I want them to be able to easily like reference those. And so I just have them as big posters in my room and it works out really well. The other thing is, do you want to be able to go over any student work or project any student work, kind of display that as kids do things? I've done this in the past, and kids really love it. And it really honestly comes down to what you want. and what you are thinking when you're setting up your classroom. So those are just some things to be aware of. The other thing that kind of goes with setting up your classroom, basically number 3 says, what will your blank procedures be or look like? So also when setting up your classroom, like where you're going to put certain things is important based on your procedures. So if you have students turn in assignments, where are they going to turn in assignments, and how is that going to be easily like accessible to them? And then bell ringers or bell work, like when students enter the classroom, like how do they come into the classroom? That kind of would go with the flow of how easily they can get to their seats, or what you want them to do when they first get to class. If you have them do frequent like bell work or some entrance tickets, where it's like a paper copy or something that they need to grab. Maybe when they like walk into the class, like first thing there might be a table or a little like nook that like they know every time if there's a paper on here, like I'm taking it because this is the bell ringer for the day or whatever it may be. And then also end of class routine. Like how are you going to end the class, or how are you going to end the day? And that kind of goes into setting up your classroom. Also along with this would just be like, where are you going to have supplies for your students to use? So how easily accessible will that be for them, and what kind of flow do you want for that? For example, if your student needs to get up and sharpen their pencil, I would not put it in the front of the class, because if you're lecturing, then it would be super disruptive to what you were doing, or really any materials that kids might need to access frequently. You don't want to put up there just on the off chance that they'll get up while you're talking, or they'll be just that more disruptive if they go to the front of the class. Maybe put it off to the corner, like mine is in the back corner of my room. My students, I also talk to them about they're not allowed to get up and sharpen their pencils if I or anybody is up in front of the class talking, or if we're having like any sort of discussion. That is to wait until like a lull moment, or when they're working independently. So that's something to think about. Number 4, will you be giving your students homework? So you got to think about that, because that can also feed into like what are your procedures for that, and how you have them set up, like turning in things. What will your grading policy be? That's another thing to think about. Just in general, not necessarily for a classroom setup. How are you going to communicate with parents and guardians? That's another thing to think about right off the bat. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we also talk about materials to prep. And then number 7 is, how will your agenda be posted, or what will you use your board space for? So that's something very important to think about, especially, well, I don't know if your class will be like my class, but I definitely have students that are on IEPs, and one of something that could be in an IEP or written for a kid on an IEP is to have like a visual schedule. And so I find it very helpful for that reason to have my agenda, like my daily agenda and weekly agenda posted for students, but also it helps me keep track. It helps the students. They know exactly what they're doing for the day. It's very like straightforward. And so it really helps with that. So this is really just to go over how to set up your classroom, and hopefully I've given you guys some things to think about when it comes to that. Part 2 is going to be going over more specific things when it comes to like lesson planning and materials to prep. So hopefully this video helped, and please watch part 2, because that will also be a super helpful video for you.